Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Brush and Bubbles YouTube channel. Today I'm excited to announce that we are going to be finally painting a disco ball. This is probably one of our most requested tutorials to date. So first of all, please don't worry if you haven't painted ever or since school. I'm going to be taking you through everything nice and slowly, step by step. I'll be showing you the brands of paints that I'm using, a few different techniques, the different sized brushes that I'm using, all of the equipment that I like to use for my tutorials. We're going to start with our acrylic paint for the background and to create our structure, and then I move over to gouache paint. Gouache is part of the watercolour family. Don't worry if you haven't got gouache paint, you can just stick with the acrylic paint. I just wanted to use it because gouache is a little bit more buttery and opaque, and it goes on quite matte. Finally, I finished with a little bit of metallic paint just to give it a little bit of extra sparkle. If you haven't got metallic paint, then don't worry, you don't need it. So without further ado, let's jump straight into our disco ball painting. As you can see, I have set myself up with everything that I'm going to need for this painting. So I would make sure that you're spending just a few moments getting yourself all settled. You have everything that you need in front of you. So I've got my round canvas here. I've got two different size paintbrushes. These are slightly bigger square brushes that I'm going to be using for the background. I'll be adding the different brushes later. Some kitchen towel just for dabbing our brushes off, a cup of water. As mentioned, you can use any colours that you wish for this painting. You can really go wild with your own creations. But to start with, I've got quite a lot of titanium white. This is a wonderful fluorescent paint. This is permanent rose, ultramarine blue, violet. This green is just called mid green, and this yellow is just called mid yellow. We'll be adding loads of different layers to our disco ball, and to start with we just want to create a really fun, colourful rainbow background. Now the great thing about this is we don't need to be neat with the application of the paint, we don't want to be too precise. This is really going to essentially be covered up, but we just want to start with quite a pop of colour for our background. So taking my big brush, I'm just going to dip it in the water, loosen up those bristles slightly. And then moving over to my paint palette, I'm just going to scoop up a little bit of this white, just moving it over to an area where I've got some space. And I'm going to start with my fluorescent pink, because I'm just picking up a little bit of that pink and I'm just going to mix it into the white. Now I'm not going to overly mix it, I'm going to still let it be quite stripy when you can see it on the brush here. And all we're going to start doing is just swooping it onto the canvas. Now the great thing about this painting is you can be super abstract with it. We don't want it to be neat, we don't want it to be tidy. I'm just sort of getting that paint off the brush onto the canvas, and I'm keeping with this sort of circular shape of this canvas as well. So I'm being quite slapdash with my application of the paint, as you can see. And then what we can start to do to this is just start adding these different colours. So I might then pick up a little bit of the fluorescent pink on my brush and then maybe just add that, blending it in on top. We don't need to be overly blending the paint here because we want it just to sort of be very abstract. These are just hints of colour, and really we are going to be covering all of this up. This is just the first layer of our fabulous disco ball. I'm really not overthinking what I'm doing here. We can always add more paint over the top, and we're going to start adding a few other colours now too. Again, up to you. Pick whatever colour you fancy next. I'm not even going to wash off my brush. I'm just going to scoop up a little bit more of my white, adding it to a space, and then I'm going to pick up a small amount of my blue. And again, I'm just sort of mixing it in there, but I'm not overly mixing it, just so that when it comes to applying on the canvas, you get these nice sort of different array of colours. And then I'm just going to start blending that over the top of some of the pink, bringing it around if I've got any gaps. You can see I'm kind of changing the direction of the paintbrush. The more sort of random and messy this is, I think the better. You can always go back to your white and pink and add a bit more of that in. If you want to blend it up slightly, you should just start getting nice sort of mixes of colours here. I'm going back to my pink and I'm just sort of swirling in some of that in there. If you need to, you can always add a little bit more water to your brush, dab it on your kitchen towel and go back in. Where the blue and the pink meet, it should turn into a little bit more of a mauve purple colour too. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to wash off my brush, giving it a little tap on the base of my cup. It just helps lift off the excess paint. Dabbing it on the kitchen towel so it's not too wet. And then moving back over here, I'm going to pick up a little bit more of the white and I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to this, just to mix it up and make a nice sort of lemon, pastel lemon shade. And again, I'm just adding this in the gaps, blending it over the top. Where that yellow meets the pink, it should turn a little bit more of a peach tone or more of a sort of orange tangerine tone. I think the trick here is you don't want to overly blend each time because then it ends up looking like a bit of a mess. So you almost want to know when to step away. And then I'm just going to pick up a little more of the white, adding a tiny bit of green to it, making a nice light green shade, and I'm going to do the same with the green. Now, if there's ever an area of this that you think, oh, I just don't like that, I don't like how those colours look, it looks a little bit muddy, you can always wash off your brush, dab it on the kitchen towel, and just pick up another colour. I would always say, as a sort of rule, go back to a colour that's nice and pastel in tone. The colours that have got a little bit more of the white in them tend to be slightly more opaque, so they blend in quite nicely and just give you a nice sort of highlight shade. So just spend a few more moments adding to your disco ball. Remember, most of this is going to be covered up. This is just the first layer, so try not to be too hard on yourself. Just be nice and free, enjoy it. And then we'll move on to the next stage. Once you're happy with that, we're just going to give our two big brushes a good wash. We're done with them now, so you can kind of pop them to the side. We want to give the background of our canvas a nice time to dry, so just leave it for 5 minutes. If you want to speed up the process, you can always use a hairdryer just on a low heat, just to help speed it along slightly. While we wait for our background to dry, I'm just going to show you on these two examples here a few options of how we're going to create the structure for our disco ball. So these are basically the grids where all of the little cutout mirror discs go. So the first option you have is you can almost just have your disco ball tilted to the side slightly. So we'll just do lines going across. We're going to be using a light blue colour to do this. Kind of trying to make them as even as possible, but it really doesn't matter if they're not. I'm just keeping it with a slight curve as well of the disco ball. And then after we've done that, we can then go in and create these lines going down. So we want them not to match, so I'm just sort of staggering them as we go along. And these are where the different colours are going to sit within the ball. That's a very rough idea of what we can do. So that's one option. The other option, which is slightly more detailed, is if we want to be seeing the ball from sort of underneath the disco ball as if it was a little bit kind of up in the sky doing its thing. We start down here and we just do a small sort of circle. And then we kind of carry on doing circle around that one circle until we get to the edge of the ball. And we just follow it round. And then it goes into these sort of curve-like shapes. Then what we do is the same thing, so we create our little mirror discs, just going outwards from that middle circle to start with, and then the same as we did on the other side, we just want to stagger them. So in between this one, I'll do another one, and so on and so forth. So there you have two very rough kind of examples of what we can do. We can either have them going like this down, we don't see the bottom, we don't see the top, or we can kind of do it so that we can see the base of the disco ball. Now that my background is nice and dry, I'm going to move on to drawing in these lines we've just practiced. So here I have two different brushes. I have one which has got slightly more of a slanted edge, and this one is more square. So I'm going to be going between both of these. I'm going to start with this one just to mix up my blue shade. So I'm going to make a light blue colour, and this is what we're going to draw in all of these lines with. So picking up quite a large amount of white paint, I'm actually just going to pop it on the area that I had my blue to start with. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of my blue and give it a mix. I would then just recommend adding a few drops of water into your mixture as well, just to keep it nice and fluid. And then just really mix that water in. I'm going to pick up the brush with the slightly slanted edge to do all of these lines. If you haven't got one of these brushes, then please don't worry, you can just use a square brush or even a smaller pointy one. I'm going to go with the left-hand side design for this disco ball. And if this is your first time painting one of these, I would also suggest just starting with this. The more you do, the more you can kind of experiment with the different sort of angles that you're painting the ball in. So sticking with that same formula that we've practiced, I'm just picking up some of this light blue colour. I'm going to start at the base here, and I'm just going to do curved line going down at the base. And you don't have to be too neat with this. Just carry on doing this all the way up. Don't worry if your lines are a little bit wonky. When you look closely at a disco ball, they aren't ever really neat because the little mirror discs go in all sorts of different directions. They often don't look too precise, which is nice. It means that they're a nice, freeing, forgiving subject to paint. So while I wait for that to dry, I'm just going to add a little bit more white to this blue, because I'm going to go over and do another layer of this, and I just want it to stand out nicely. So I'm just mixing in that white just to give it a slightly lighter tone, just so it pops a bit more. You'll find that some of these lines are already drying, so where the ones are already drying, I'm just going to carefully just go over them, just so I can see them clearly. As soon as you're happy with that, we can just pop our brush down. I'm now moving over to a slightly smaller brush. If you've just got a small pointy one, you can use that, or if you're happy sticking with the one that you've got, you can just carry on using the same brush. All I'm going to do now is just pick up some more of this colour, and this is where we're going to add the little squares. So again, just starting at the base. This is up to you how big you want your squares. You might want them quite big and quite separated, or you might want them quite small. So I'm going to do mine kind of medium. So down here I'm going to have about 3 or 4, I'd say. And I'm just going to use that as my reference and then carry on going up from there. Just remember to sort of angle the lines with the lines that you've already got, so they wouldn't be straight, they would kind of curve round with the stripes we've already added on. And if you get to the end, you might just see a kind of little triangle of one of them. Now remember, we're going to be adding so many different layers on top of this, so we're even going to be going back at the end to add some of these sort of blue lines and stuff around them, just so that we can really see what we've got going on our disco ball. But this is just one of the stages of the kind of configuration of our disco ball, just laying it all out, getting the structure in there. But remember not to overthink it, you can just enjoy this. You can have a very abstract looking disco ball. In fact, they always look quite abstract once they're finished, which is nice. As long as you're enjoying the process, that's really all that matters. And then we have the main structure of our disco ball. So while we give that a moment to dry, I would just wash off your brushes just so they're nice and clean. This is where I'm going to swap over to a different type of paint. So the paint that I'm now going to start using is gouache. So gouache is very similar to a watercolour, however it dries opaque, so it's a lot thicker in texture. And it tends to sort of dry flat, which I really want to try out with this style of painting. So if you want to just carry on with your acrylics, that's absolutely fine. They work really, really well. I've done these paintings before completely using acrylics, but I'm going to experiment with the Winsor & Newton gouache paints. So I'm going to start with quite a lot of white as my base. I'm just going to do little sort of dabs of the white along my palette, and this is where I'll be adding my other colours next to, and then I can use them to mix up. So we are going to be using quite a lot of white just to create some more pastel shades. I'll talk you through the colours I'm going to be using. I'm using a permanent yellow in deep, brilliant violet, ultramarine, which is a blue, permanent green, middle, permanent crimson. Then I'll be mixing up the crimson and the white to make a pink. So moving back over to my square brush, I'm just going to start mixing up my first colour. So I'm going to stick with blue for now. So I'm just going to pick up some of this white. So you can tell it's quite thick. And I'm just going to add a little bit of my blue to it, and I'm just going to give it a good mix in. Now this always has quite like a sticky gum consistency to it. And the nice thing about gouache is the more water you add, it kind of turns into more of a watercolour consistency, so a lot thinner. But it means that you can go in there quite thick. But I am going to add a couple of drops of water to this just to keep it nice and fluid. Really mixing it in. I'm going to create a few different shades of blue to start with. So this is my first shade, which is quite pastel in tone. And the next colour I'm going to mix just right next to it. It's going to be slightly darker. So again, I just want to start with a little bit of white. And this time I'm going to add a little bit more blue to it. Just mixing up right next to my first colour, just so I can see the difference in shades. Now this is really where you can have fun, because don't worry if your colours don't look like mine. As long as you're happy with the shades that you're making, honestly, that's all that matters. And then I'm going to go one step further and mix up a next shade of blue. So again, just scooping up some of my white. I like adding the white as the base just because it helps keep the paint more opaque, so less see-through. I'm just picking up some more of the blue, and I'm going to add a tiny bit of the green to this, and this should give us a sort of turquoise tone. So it's still sort of within the blue family, but it's almost that aquamarine sort of lagoon shade. Again, I'll just add a tiny drop of water to this as well. So here I have 3 colours, so I'm just going to start using these 3 shades to start with, these cooler tones, and then we can carry on making different colours and adding them to our painting. So the nice thing about this is we're just going to start filling in some of these sort of shapes that we've already created. Now, when you look at a disco ball, you'll see that it captures all sorts of different light from different areas. So you'll have an area of sort of blues, greens, maybe pinks, depending on what is reflecting in them. We're going for a very rainbow disco ball for our painting today. So I'm just going to start adding these different sort of bluey green tones in these areas, just clustering them sort of together, and then I might do the same down here or over there. And this is where you can start to decide if you want to fill in this whole gap that you've got. So I've got quite a long brick shape, for example, here, but actually I think it looks really good, especially as I'm using this square brush. Just sort of dragging the paintbrush down creates these shapes. So I might just start doing that, just still keeping within the lines, but I might not fill in that whole gap because I want it to look a little bit more square rather than rectangle. And this always feels quite strange because it is so random, but we need it to be random. And actually we're just going to carry on adding and adding and adding the different colours. And then we'll go back to some of these as well. So this is sort of something that you just need to relax into and trust the process. It takes time, this painting, but it is really fun once you get into it. You can try and keep your shapes that you're painting sort of as square as possible. You don't have to be too overly precious with it. Again, we're going to be adding so many different colours to this that it doesn't really matter, but it's just quite nice to sort of keep it in mind as you go. So I might add some of these down here as well. Quite nice as well, in between some of these eventually we might just leave a few little gaps so we can see sort of bits of our background that we did at the start sort of shining through as well. Then whenever you're happy you can just give your brush a little wash. We can always go back to that colour, dab on the kitchen towel, and then pick up your next shade. So I might go for this mid shade of blue that I created, just making sure that that water's really blended in there. I'm picking up quite a lot of the paint. I'm just going to start adding these sort of next to and around these first squares. If they're still quite wet, your first sort of turquoise squares or whatever colour you've used, then you can always just leave a little gap between them and then go back with your next colour and fill them in a bit. There's no real formula with this. And again, you can just start picking random areas. You might also have a few sort of random blues just dotted around. I find with these paintings, you just have to let yourself get lost in it and just enjoy the process rather than overthink them. What's quite nice about this is we're just doing the same thing each time now with all the different colours. We can also cover up some of these squares. If you feel like later on you've got too many blues and you want to add some more purples or pinks, you can just then paint on top of these. So you've got room to sort of amend as we go further on down the line. Again, remember, you don't have to follow me where I'm putting my shapes at all. Feel free to just carry on with your own painting, doing whatever you want, placing them wherever you want. I've just picked up some of my lighter shade of blue and I'm just going in with that now. Just dotting it around these areas, but then also might place a few elsewhere as well. Sometimes it might be quite nice if I've got this lighter blue which I'm putting up here on the top section of it, I might then add later on like a mauve colour or a lilac which will sit quite nicely next to it. I might even make a slightly lighter shade of blue, so I might just pick up a bit more of my white and mix it into this over here just to create a really light sky blue, and then go ahead and add that in between some of these other shades. So I'll carry on talking you through what I'm doing in case you really want to follow along, but at this stage, if you're quite happy, you can just carry on using any of the colours that you want. I might just add a little bit more white to this turquoise colour just in the corner, just to make a lighter shade of that as well. I'm going to go one step further and just change this colour again, so adding a little bit more white just to the corner. I'm just going to then add a tiny little bit of yellow, give that a mix and make this kind of very light green yellow shade. So this is where if you feel like you want to like overlap any of the other ones that you've got with any of your new colours, then you can. So I'm now just going to wash off my brush. And I'm just going to start making a few more green colours. So I'm going to again start with some white. And then I'm going to add some of this green to it. This is going to give us a slightly brighter tone. Again, remember, you can always cover up past colours. If you don't like them, you cover them up. These paintings always take on so many different forms as you go. It's quite nice to see, and you probably will get sort of more of a knack for it. You might be a little bit neater with your shapes that you're creating a little bit later. So, you know, it's one of those things where we're just going to carry on layering and working on it until we're happy. And sometimes with some of these colours, you might not see them everywhere. There might just be a couple like clustered together, and then they make them kind of stand out at the end. So you don't have to add loads of each colour. You can just maybe have a few dotted in there. I might change up this colour a little bit more, so I'm going to add some more white just to make it lighter. So washing off my brush, I'm now going to move on to mixing up a couple of yellow colours. So I've run out of white paint on my palette, so I'm just going to add a little bit more white paint. And we're going to do the same thing, just making a few different yellow shades, orange shades, peach shades, whatever you fancy. So just make sure your brush is nice and clean if you've been using green or any other colours on it before. And then over here I'm just going to pick up some of that white and add a little bit of yellow to it. Just making a nice sort of pastel yellow shade. And I'm just going to add a little bit of my red, tiny bit of my red to this, and just mix it up just to get a little bit more of an orangey tone. Might even add a tiny touch more white to it as well, just to keep it nice and light. And I'm just focusing these kind of next to and around and nearby to the yellows. So again, not, you know, making it a rule to have them right next to each one, but kind of in the vicinity. And this is where we'll start to like see different clusters of light, the different clusters of our paints kind of merging together on our disco ball. Don't worry if ever you get any mistakes and stuff, because at the end we're going to go back in with some of our light blue just to give a bit more of a crisp definition between some of these colours. So don't worry if your little squares or rectangles aren't perfect, because we are going to be neating it up later. I'm just going to add a little bit more white to this and a little bit more red, and just change up the colour. So here I have a little bit more of a pinky peach shade. And then again, I'm just going to add this next to and around and nearby. I'm now going to mix up my first of many shades of pink. So I've got some white here. I'm just picking up some of this red and I'm just mixing that in. I want to have a few different sort of shades of pink to use for this painting. Adding a bit more white to it just to lighten it up slightly. I'm just going to go ahead and do the same thing, adding it in. Going to lighten it up slightly, some more white to it. And I'm just adding some more white to it as well, just to really lighten it up. I want a really, really pale pastel shade. Now I'm going to make a really light shade of pink, so I'm actually not adding any more pink. I'm just mixing up whatever I've got left on my brush with some white, just so it's super, super pastel. Tiny dab of water. And go in with this as well. Again, remember you can always cover up any of the other colours that you don't want. I'm now going to stay with this on my brush. I'm just going to add a little bit more white to my palette. I'm now just going to mix up a very pastel violet colour. So there's a tiny bit of this purple that I've got, mixing it in with that light pink from my brush, and lots of white paint. Just darkening it up slightly so I can really see it. Mixing up a lighter version, just using the paint on my brush and lots of white. So I'm just going in and I'm covering up some of the slightly darker squares that I've got. I feel like I might have too many of them. It's nice to have a couple of the darker shades in there, but if you feel like you've got too many, and I do, I'm just covering them up with this lighter tone. So some of these reds, for example, just mixed up an even lighter pink, just going back in with some of that just to give it a little pop. Quite nice to add these slightly lighter tones in amongst a few of your darker areas just to really make it shine. So you could have kind of one there and then diagonally up or diagonally down. Just going back in with a really light yellow, going over some of the light yellows I already had just to really make them pop, and adding in any extras as well. And also going in with a really light turquoise colour, which I've just mixed with mostly white, tiny bit of blue, tiny bit of green, again just in the areas just to sort of make certain areas really pop with those lighter shades. At this point you can just go over some of the other shades that you don't quite want. So I'm now just going in with a couple of white squares. Just popping them on top of some of the colours that I've already got. I'm just clustering these whites sort of in the same area just so it looks like there's a lot of shine going on. So as a finishing touch, I just want to go back in and just re-find all of those lines that we created for our structure, just to give it a little bit of separation between each of our different discs. So I'm just going to mix up a really light shade of blue. So I've got my white there, just picking up a little bit of blue, and I'm going to give it a good mix. And then you can take any brush that you prefer. You might want to go back to the one that you used originally to draw in those lines. I'm going to go for a slightly sort of smaller tipped brush for this, just so I can have a little bit more control. So I'm just taking the smaller brush, picking up some of this light blue paint. Now just going to very carefully just do little lines. These don't need to be too neat or straight. We just want to start getting back in a little bit of that structure that we've lost. And you can just do the little lines in between if you want to. You don't have to do them on all of them. We just start getting a little bit more definition back into our disco ball. As a last finishing touch, we can do a couple of sparkles shining off the disco ball. So for this, what we're going to do is just do a little dot and then flick the brush out just to create sort of little sparkles within our disco ball. So if we want to take it a step further, I'm just going to use a little bit of silver metallic paint, and we can just use this to add some extra shimmer to our disco ball. So I'm just going to take my smaller brush, just washing off any of that blue or white paint, and then taking some of this metallic, I'm just going to start adding maybe a few little lines, dashes, just sporadically, so that once we've finished, it will sort of give a little bit of an extra shimmer to our painting. So you can just have fun with this. If you are using metallic, go ahead and add it wherever you want to now. And there you have your finished disco ball painting. Thank you all so much for watching. If you like this video, then don't forget to give us a little thumbs up, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye!